This is Ken Hance, best storyteller in Texas, and today we have Senator Ted Cruz, who has served 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, will be running for election next year, trying to serve the 3rd term. Senator, congratulations, and we appreciate you being here, and we want to talk to you a little about not just politics, but we want to talk to you about you. And tell me about your parents.
Well, Chancellor, great to be with you. Thank you for your hospitality. I'm in your home right now, and I appreciate you and your wife welcoming Heidi and me and our 2 girls to your home. You're a great American, a great Texan, and a great warrior. You're an incredible evangelist for Texas Tech. You love Texas Tech. My daughters are 12 and 15. You tried to recruit them both to Tech tonight. My 12-year-old said she probably should get out of junior high first. But I appreciate all you do, and I appreciate your friendship.
Well, you're welcome, and I appreciate your friendship. Tell me about your parents.
Well, sure. My dad, as you know, is from Cuba, and my father was born in Cuba, grew up there, and he fought in the Cuban Revolution as a kid. When he was a teenager, he fought actually alongside Fidel Castro, and he didn't know Castro was a communist. He just knew Batista, who was the dictator. He was cruel and he was corrupt. And he spent 4 years fighting in the revolution. When he was 17, they threw my dad in jail. They tortured my father in Cuba. And he got out of jail, and he applied to 3 U.S. universities. He applied to University of Miami, LSU, and University of Texas. And UT let him in. And so that's how I came to be a Texan. In 1957, he got on a ferry boat. He went to Key West. He got on a Greyhound bus, and he took a Greyhound bus from Key West all the way to Austin, Texas. And he got to Austin in 1957. He got a job washing dishes. He made 50 cents an hour. And he couldn't speak English, but he went to school full time, and he worked for the American dream. And my dad, my whole life, my dad's been my hero. He's 84 now, and he's still larger than life. He's a pastor today, and we're incredibly close. And you know, his story embodies the American dream. My mom's from Wilmington, Delaware, and she is Irish and Italian. She came from a working class family. So her mother, my grandmother, was the 2nd youngest of 17 kids. So it was a big family. No one had ever gone to college. And my mom became the first in her family ever to go to college. And she went to Rice, graduated in 1956 with a degree in math. And you want to talk about an era when there were not a lot of women going to college. There were even fewer who were majoring in math. And she came out of Rice in 1956. She went to work at Shell as a computer programmer. And talk about 2 industries that were not hospitable to women. You had computer programming, you had oil and gas, and she was right at the intersection of them both. My mom is 88. She'll turn 89 in November, and she is an incredibly strong woman. She's been a best friend of me my whole life. Both my parents, I could not be more fortunate or more blessed to have 2 parents who've been beyond amazing to me.
Your mom was a pioneer.
Yeah.
Your dad, he was a revolutionary that got to a point where he saw the American dream and said, "I want that."
Yes.
And they were successful. Where did they meet?
So they met in New Orleans. So they both worked at oil and gas. My dad went to work at IBM, started in 1962, and he became a computer programmer as well. He was a mathematician. Both of them were math majors. And they met in New Orleans working in oil and gas, and they ended up starting a small business together and working together for 30 years running a small business. But I'll tell you an interesting story about my mom, and it's a legislative story that you'll like. You ever see the movie Hidden Figures?
Yes.
It's a fantastic movie. It is about the pioneering African-American women mathematicians who worked at NASA.
Right.
And when it came out, I took Heidi, my wife, I took both my daughters, and I took my mom, all of them to go see it. And afterwards with my daughters, I took a chance to really sit down and talk with them about the movie. And I told them, they call my mom Mimi. And I told them, I said, Mimi was like those women. And so the movie starts with the Russians launching Sputnik and starting the space race. And one of my mom's very first jobs, she left Shell, she went to work at the Smithsonian, and one of her first jobs was helping compute the orbits for Sputnik. And this was in the 1950s. This was even before the movies was set in the 60s. So I asked her, I said, Mom, how accurate was the movie? And she thought it was very accurate. I said, well, one of the things that was kind of weird listening to it with a modern ear is they referred to these women as computers. And we think of a computer as a hunk of metal on your desk, not a person.
Right.
And my mom laughed. She said, my first job at Shell, my title was computer. She said, I had a business card that said Eleanor Dara Computer. And that's what they called her. And so, that story I told my daughters, and I ended up coming up with an idea. I introduced legislation in the Senate to rename the street in front of NASA headquarters Hidden Figures Way. And so I introduced that legislation, and here's where it takes a weird bounce. A city council member in D.C. who's a Democrat, he saw my legislation. He said, that's a really good idea. He liked it. So he picked it up and he got it passed in the D.C. City Council. And so if you go right now to the NASA headquarters, they've renamed the street. And I was there at the dedication. So the city council member and I both spoke. And I told my mom's story. And I said, look, at some level, you might think, all right, a street sign, that's not that big a deal. But in 10 years or 50 years or 100 years from now, a little girl or a little boy is going to go to Washington. They're going to go see NASA. They're going to look up and see that sign, and they're going to say, what does that mean? And they're going to hear these stories of these African-American women without whom we don't go to the moon. And so that was really just kind of a neat intersection of my family story and my job representing Texas in Washington.
That's a great story. Computer.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't say computer analyst and computer vice president, just computer.
Because you computed.
Yeah.
I mean, back then, a computer is someone who computes.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And so big change. Now, your parents, you were living in Houston.
Yeah.
When you went to school.
I did.
You started school in Houston.
Yeah, I grew up in Houston. I'm a lifelong Houstonian. I was actually born in Canada, in Calgary. My parents were in the oil and gas business. They'd started a small business there. And then when I was 4, they left Calgary. They came back to Texas, came to Houston. So I grew up in Houston. And I graduated from Second Baptist High School in Houston, was class of 88. Little bitty school. It was...
How many in your class?
43.
43, and you graduated.
Yeah.
Ed Young was the pastor then. I think he still is.
He still is. You want to talk about someone with a fountain of youth? Ed Young has not aged in 50 years. I don't know how he does it, but he...
But when did he start as the pastor at Second Baptist?
I don't know when he started.
It was in the 70s.
Yeah, he had been there. I was class of 88, and he'd been there a long time, so I don't know when he first started, but he still preaches every Sunday, and he's a good friend.
Good guy.
He's a great guy, and it's a wonderful community. And it was, when I was in high school, so it was the 80s, and my parents it was a small business. They did seismic data processing, and you remember the 80s when oil collapsed and the prices dropped, and they went bankrupt. We lost everything. When I was in high school, we lost the company, we lost our home. They went completely bankrupt, and I was, I think, a junior in high school when that happened. And so when I went off to college, I was 17, and my parents were still in bankruptcy. So they didn't have a nickel. And so I got some scholarships, and I took student loans, and I got 2 jobs, and I,
you went to Princeton.
I did.
And you graduated Princeton with honors,
Yep.
and then you went on to Yale.
Actually, Harvard. But
you went to Harvard.
Yeah.
I don't know why I said Yale. Maybe I was trying to insult
forgive you for it.
Okay. And Alan Dershowitz talks about that you were the brightest student he had. And I think that's saying a lot because he's a bright guy.
He's a brilliant guy. He's a good friend, and he was an amazing professor. I had him for criminal law, I had him for a couple of classes, and he was a fantastic friend, and he's been very kind saying that.
Right, and he's not been bashful about it.
He's not bashful about anything.
He doesn't have a bashful.
His nature.
He doesn't have a bashful side. And after you got out of Harvard Law School,
you want to hear an interesting Dershowitz story?
Sure.
So when I was a 3L in law school, I was dating a 1L, a woman who was taking Dershowitz's class. And Dershowitz would get up teaching criminal law, and he would slam Scalia, he'd slam Thomas, he'd slam Rehnquist, all the conservative justices that he disagreed with. And the students in his class, they decided, okay, we had enough of this. So they wrote a letter to Justice Scalia. And they said, "Dear Justice Scalia, our professor, Alan Dershowitz, he keeps criticizing you in class. Would you come defend yourself?" And Scalia ended up deciding, sure, I will. So he flew up to Boston. He went to Harvard. And there was a whole criminal law class that was a one-on-one debate between Antonin Scalia and Alan Dershowitz. And Scalia said, "We'll do it, but no press." So this wasn't filmed. It wasn't public. And my girlfriend knew me well enough. It was during finals, and I had a final exam that was an 8-hour take-home. And she knew if I knew about it, I would have skipped an hour and a half of the final to go watch this debate because Dershowitz was a good friend, and I revered Antonin Scalia.
Right.
So she didn't tell me about it because she said, "I'm going to save you from being stupid by just not letting you know enough to be stupid." But she smuggled a tape recorder in. And so she tape recorded the debate. And after my final was over, she said, "All right, Ted, here's what happened." And she let me play the debate. And it was, they both held their own really well. And it was a neat story.
I had Scalia as a guest at Texas Tech a couple of times.
Yep.
He did a great job. He was well received and was, everyone enjoyed him.
By any measure, he's one of the most consequential Supreme Court justices in our nation's history. And he was
absolutely
brilliant and principled and just an extraordinary man.
Right. What you graduated from Harvard,
yeah,
honors, and then where'd you go?
So I was a law clerk. I clerked on the Court of Appeals for a judge named Michael Ludig, who was a young judge. He was 41 at the time. And then
he was on the Court of Appeals in D.C.
In Virginia, so the Fourth Circuit, so right outside D.C. And then I clerked on the Supreme Court for Chief Justice William Rehnquist, which was an incredible experience. He was a very close friend and mentor. He was a father figure to me, and working for him was breathtaking every day.
Clerking for a Supreme Court justice, much less the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is a big deal. For those of you that are not lawyers, I mean, that's the top of the chain. So when you left and went out to practice law, where'd you go?
So, well, let me tell you about clerking for a second. So when I was in high school, I read a book that's called The Brethren that Bob Woodward wrote.
Right.
And it's an expose.
It's a good book.
It's a very good book, and it's about the Supreme Court. It talks about law clerks quite a bit. It was a scandal in the court because a bunch of law clerks shot their mouth off, and the justices were really mad at it. But I read it in high school, and I thought, this is the coolest job on earth. So when I was a teenager, I set a goal. I want to do that because that just sounds amazing.
You wanted to be a clerk. When by the time you were in high school, you wanted to be a clerk on the U.S. Supreme Court.
I did. And so Rehnquist was an incredible man. He was someone who was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, blue collar roots. He fought in World War II, and he was an enlisted man. He was not an officer. He was a sergeant. He was a weather observer in North Africa. And he ended up he was at Stanford Law School. He was first in his class at Stanford Law School. Actually, same class, Sandra Day O'Connor. They were classmates. She was number 3. I've always thought, who was the poor schlub who was number 2 between them?
It didn't amount to much.
Apparently not. And actually, they dated. He asked Sandra Day O'Connor to marry him, and she turned him down. And it ended up they both married, and they and their spouses were good friends. But Rehnquist was brilliant at a level that was terrifying. He had a mind that was spectacular. And I remember we used to meet with him every morning, 9 a.m. in chambers, and he had bookcases in his office, and he had all the U.S. reports on them. And he'd look at us and he'd say, "Oh, you don't happen to know the citation of Smith versus Jones, do you?" Some case we were talking about. And we'd go, "No." And he'd point at the bookcase. He'd say, "Try 309 U.S. around page 407. And he was always right. He had a pure photographic memory.
Wow.
I mean, it was incredible, and he was down to earth. I don't think William Rehnquist would have treated anyone differently. If he'd been a plumber his whole life, he would have interacted identically. But when I interviewed, so he interviewed every year, typically between 12 and 15 recent law graduates, and he was hiring 3 law clerks. So most people he interviewed, he didn't get. And he did a short interview. So I remember my interview started at 2 p.m. It was over at 2:17, so 17 minutes. And I went in, and I think what he was doing is he was so smart, he didn't need us. We were almost useless. He could do the job practically with one eye closed and both hands tied behind his back.
Didn't need a clerk.
Didn't need him. So he really wanted three people that would not bore him and that would be, I guess, mildly interesting to spend every day for a year working with. So he's kind of looking for, all right, who do I like? Who do I think would be interesting? And so I did an interview with him, and it went fine. And I think there are two reasons I got the job. One, I told him my dad had been a communist guerrilla, which my father was horrified about afterwards. He's like, you did not tell him that. I said, well, yeah, I did. I was trying to make an impression. But then secondly, as the interview was over, at 2:17, he's walking me out. And I said, you know, Mr. Chief Justice, I should tell you, I'm actually kind of bittersweet about being here. And he looks at me completely puzzled. He said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, tonight is game 4 of the NBA Finals. And my Houston Rockets are about to sweep Orlando to win back-to-back national championships. And I had tickets to the game tonight. And I gave them up to come interview with you here today. And he cracks up laughing. And he goes, well, I think you made the right decision. Only reason I got the job is I made him laugh. And as someone, Kent, you're one of the funniest people in all of Texas, and you use humor beautifully to tell a story. I would not have had that job if I hadn't made my future boss laugh at least once.
That's a great story. You know, I mean, you had to set yourself aside of those other, how many?
Yeah, it was like 12 to 15, and he was going to hire 3.
And so you did it with that one story. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. That's great. So you clerked for him. What year did you stop clerking for him?
So 96 to 97 is when I clerked for him.
Okay.
And then I went to work at a little bitty law firm in D.C. that was called Cooper & Carvin, and it was 6 lawyers. I was the 7th lawyer, and it was a litigation boutique. It did big commercial litigation, and it did constitutional litigation and Supreme Court litigation. And so I went to work for 2 lawyers, Chuck Cooper and Mike Carvin, who were both
I know Chuck Cooper.
Great guy, one of my closest friends in the world. And they were both Chuck and Mike were really senior lawyers in the Reagan Justice Department. And I'll tell you, some of the best advice I ever got, if you're coming out of law school or just coming out of school, work for someone you want to learn from. Look, every lawyer, you don't learn to be a lawyer in law school. You learn the same way Abraham Lincoln did, by apprenticing, by carrying someone's bag and watching and seeing how they do it. And I went to work there because I looked at Chuck and Mike and I said, I want to do what you do. And so I just want to watch everything you do and try to learn. And I think that was true 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and it's true today.
I dealt with Chuck. We were involved in a case where the United Airlines, the pilots and the flight, some of the flight attendants, they did not want to have to take the shot, and they fought it, and we were involved in that at the federal level. And he is a brilliant guy.
He's a brilliant guy. He's been a mentor to me, and I'll tell you, in 2016 when I ran for president, Chuck has an incredibly successful law practice. He's made millions and millions of dollars. He's one of the top Supreme Court lawyers in the country. Chuck took a leave of absence from his practice for I think almost a year and moved to Houston just to volunteer full-time on my campaign. I never paid him a nickel. And he just came to give his advice. So debate prep, you look at all those debates. You've done a lot of political debates. Chuck was part of our debate team, and I had one of the best Supreme Court litigators in the country helping me think about, okay, Trump's going to say this, and Rubio's going to say this, and Chris Christie's going to say this, and how do you respond? And it was, I will remain forever grateful to him for that.
That's great. You had a first teamer.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Blue chip.
Who in debate prep would beat the living daylights out of you, which is what you want.
Yeah.
And you know my daughters, Caroline and Catherine. Caroline at the time was 8 and 9 years old. She was in every room for debate prep. She'd lay on the floor under the table and just soak it all up and listen to it. And we'd go for hours back and forth.
What a great experience for a child. My children were in school in 5th grade and the 8th grade when I went to Congress. And the oldest one graduated from high school in McLean, Virginia. And they really got a lot out of it. And it's a learning experience. And to be close to what's actually happening is a great experience for them. So you were with that firm how long?
Just 2 years, not very long. So I was a baby lawyer, spent 2 years there. And then I got a job to come back to Texas. And I got hired by the George W. Bush campaign in the summer of 99 to join what was the first presidential campaign, the 2000 campaign.
Right.
And so I moved back to Austin. and joined the campaign full time. Did domestic policy. So I was domestic policy advisor. I was 28, 29 years old, was a young lawyer, but helping advise then Governor Bush on domestic policy. And I spent a year and a half on the campaign, which is an amazing experience being on a presidential campaign. Best part about it is I met Heidi, my wife. I was doing domestic policy. She was doing economic policy. We were in cubicles 20 feet apart from each other. And we fell in love, been married 22 years now.
That's great. Great story. And so you were with Bush.
I was with Bush.
In the campaign, y'all won.
And then I spent 36 unforgettable days down in Florida in Tallahassee for Bush versus Gore.
Yeah, the lawsuits.
Yeah, and I was right in the middle of all of it. It was just a weird accident.
You and Jim Baker.
Yes, I worked directly for Secretary Baker, and it was a weird accident. I was the only practicing litigator who'd been on the full-time campaign staff, and I'd done constitutional litigation, and that's what we were right in the middle of. And so I ended up, at the very beginning, I sat down with Ben Ginsburg, who was the outside counsel for the campaign, and the two of us sat in a conference room, and we thought about, all right, who do we want to ask to come down? And it was like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. We literally could call any Republican lawyer in the country and they would come. And so I'd pick up the phone and I called lawyer after lawyer. Mike Carvin, my old boss, I called him. He was at a wedding in Seattle. He immediately flew back to D.C. His wife met him with a suitcase at the airport. He was down in Tallahassee like 12 hours later. I called John Roberts, now the Chief Justice. Right. He was a lawyer in D.C. John was a good friend. I said, John, we need you. He flew down immediately. And we sat there and just made a list. And the team of lawyers that came together for that litigation, I still think is the most incredible team of litigators that has ever come together. You had about a dozen 800-pound gorillas, and you've done a lot of lawsuits. Normally, right, if you have more than one, they'll kill each other.
Right.
And in this instance, the stakes were so high, and people were outraged. On the Republican side, we were looking at it saying, they are trying to steal the presidency of the United States. We're not going to let this happen. That ended up, it was an amazing legal team, and I was a 29-year-old baby lawyer carrying their briefcases up all night, helping write briefs, helping be part of the team. But it was a phenomenal experience early in my career.
But you had said the right thing at the right time to Rehnquist, or you wouldn't have been on that team.
That's exactly right. You look at one opportunity begets another, begets another, begets another.
But you said something in jest, but kind of, and it helped you, and you made a step forward, and so after the president.
But by the way, to link back, I hadn't thought of this. I don't think I've told this story before, but when I interviewed with Rehnquist, he said. He said, I've got a recommendation letter here from Charles Freed, who was the lone Republican on the Harvard Law School faculty, and he'd been Ronald Reagan's Solicitor General. He's a very talented Supreme Court litigator. He said, I've got a recommendation here from Charles Freed and one from Alan Dershowitz. He looked at me and said, how on earth did that happen? And I sort of laughed and said, well, maybe one of them was confused. I don't know. But I guess I made him laugh there too. But
That's good. That's good. That is an unusual combination, especially at that time.
Yeah.
You had what was considered a very liberal Democrat, a very conservative Republican.
Yeah.
And they both had recommended you based on your intellect and your ability to get things done.
And if they hadn't gone to bat for me, I never would have gotten the job. And that's been true at every stage. Look, I know a lot of young people, a lot of students listen to this. I'll say one of the best pieces of advice I got early on is find mentors to learn from. But also you want mentors who will guide you and go to bat for you. You want people who are going to be on your team and later in life. So listen, I've been in the Senate now 11 years. I've had hundreds of people work for me, either in the official capacity and the political capacity. And one of the things I take incredible joy from, I know you do too, is I look at how the folks, every time they leave, and I have folks, they serve 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then they go on to another job, and I sit down with them and I say, listen, we're kind of like the mafia. We're Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. This is a family for life. And I spend a lot of time pushing folks forward, advancing their career. And I take so much joy at seeing the folks that have been part of our team that are going and doing incredible things. And you usually don't get a chance to pay your mentors back. And so the only way you can do it is pay it forward. Say, someone took a chance on me and helped me get here. Now I'm going to take a chance on the next generation, and they'll never do anything for me, but hopefully they'll pay it forward to the next talented young man or young woman, and together we'll make a difference.
Well, I agree. I look back at Texas Tech and raised $1.2 billion. I was proud of that and everything.
Yeah.
But one thing I'm really proud of, there were 10 people I hired at Texas Tech that are now college presidents or chancellors.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people. And I told someone, they said, how'd you hire all those good people? I said, I try to hire someone smarter than me. And they said, well, that shouldn't be hard. And, we are able to get good people to do good things.
Well, and you know this principle, but it's an important principle, which is A's hire A's and B's hire C's. That if you're unsure of yourself, if you're scared and insecure, you're not going to hire people who are smart. I want everyone around me smarter than I am. And if you're confident and know who you are, you're willing to do that.
A's hire A's and B's hire C's.
Yeah.
I like that. I'm going to use it.
Good.
What was the next step?
So after the campaign, after Bush versus Gore, I went and joined the Bush administration. So I was at the Department of Justice, where I was an associate deputy attorney general. And then I went to the Federal Trade Commission, and I was the head of policy at the FTC. And so I did that for about 2 years. And then I got a chance to come back to Texas again.
Before you touch on that, coming back to Texas, the Justice Department, you've got a new book. Now, I want you to make a plug for it about the Justice Department, and how has it changed since you were there?
Profoundly. So the book is entitled Justice Corrupted, How the Left Has Weaponized the Legal System. And look, you look at the Department of Justice, and it has been, for decades, it's been nonpartisan. I don't want a Republican Department of Justice. I don't want a Democrat Department of Justice. I want a Department of Justice that enforces the law, regardless of your party. And what the book does is it takes you inside. It focuses on, under Barack Obama, how the Justice Department really became weaponized, and the IRS and the FBI, and they were used to target and persecute the enemies of the White House. And after 8 years of Obama, a lot of those hard partisans, they burrowed into the senior career positions at DOJ and FBI and the various federal agencies. And you look at the Trump administration, where they waged war against Donald Trump. They were mad at the American people that he got elected, and they tried to destroy him from the day he arrived. And that's not right. That's not how our system's meant to operate. And now those partisans are out in the open under Joe Biden. I think the Biden DOJ and FBI is the most partisan we've ever seen. And I think that's really, really dangerous.
Well, it's dangerous not only now, but long term.
That's exactly right.
Anytime, I think it goes back to Harry Reid. I served with Harry Reid and knew him and everything. And Harry got up there and he decided we're going to change the rules.
Yep.
Lots of times when you change the rules, those chickens will come home to roost.
I was on the Senate floor when he changed the rules in 2013, and I told several Democrats, I told Amy Klobuchar, I said, y'all are going to regret this. And I said, the result of this, you're going to see more justices like Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas confirmed because you did this. And the Democrats didn't believe it. And you look at under Trump, the 3 justices we got through, if Harry Reid hadn't changed the rules, they wouldn't have made it through.
No, not at all.
So you can thank Harry Reid. If you like the conservative majority at the court, Harry Reid and the Democrats gave it to us.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. So then you, after a couple of years with the Bush administration, you decided to come back to Texas.
Yeah. And Greg Abbott had just been elected as Attorney General. I didn't know Abbott, but I had a friend of mine who called me and said, Abbott was just elected. I said, yeah, I knew that. and he said, well, he's looking for a Solicitor General, which the Solicitor General is the chief lawyer for the state in front of the U.S. Supreme Court and all the state and federal appellate courts. And my friend said, are you willing to have your name considered? And I said, well, let me think about it. Let me talk to Heidi. And I asked Heidi what she said. And she said, yeah, you should definitely do it. Throw your name in the hat. So I said yes. I called back the next day. I said yes. And I got a call a day or two later, asked me to come down for an interview. So I flew down. I didn't know Greg Abbott at all. And I met him, I think it was November of 2002. And I had what I thought was a good interview. But I thought there was no way I'd get the job. We didn't know each other. And I figured...
How old were you at the time?
November of 2002, I was 31.
Yeah. I mean, the odds of you getting that job were slim and low.
I was a kid. I was green and young. And actually, I almost didn't get the job because Abbott thought I couldn't do oral arguments and that I wasn't up for it because I'd only argued 2 things in my life. I was still just a few years into being a lawyer. And, frankly, I figured he'd hire someone who he'd known for 10, 20 years, and that's the way of the world. And that was okay. I was glad I got the interview. And I think it was about a week later, I was with my in-laws at their house out in California. I get a call about 6 a.m. I'm in bed. I answer the phone call, and they offer me the job. And Heidi nearly fell out of bed because she confessed to me. She said, yes, do it, because she thought there was no chance on earth I'd get the job. She figured, sure, I'll support you. You'll try and you won't get it. And then I got the job. And so I ended up, moving back February of 2003, I moved back to Texas. And so started at the AG's office. Heidi stayed in D.C. She was working at the Treasury Department of the White House. And so we spent the next 2 years commuting. We'd fly back and forth from Austin to D.C. every weekend, which was really hard on a young married couple to do.
Absolutely.
But we both said, we'll put in the time and energy. And it ended up, I did that job 5.5 years. It's one of the best jobs on planet Earth because I've called that job litigation on crack. Because basically you sit in your office, you mind your own business, and incredible cases fall in your inbox one after the other after the other. And I ended up getting the opportunity to be in some of the biggest constitutional law fights in the country. And I got to say, there is a unique joy of walking into court, whether the U.S. Supreme Court or the Texas Supreme Court or any court, and saying, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, I'm here representing the great state of Texas. And it still sends chills down your spine.
That's got to be thrilling, and that's where we cross paths. And I watched you, and you handled some things that were important to higher education, important to Texas Tech, and I watched you, and I was really impressed.
Well, thank you.
And and then we had a friendship, and then later you told me you were going to run for Senate, and I thought, golly, I didn't think you could raise the money to do that.
Well, nobody did.
And that you got started. You came out to see me.
Yep.
You saw me, and you saw Jody Arrington.
Yep.
Who was chief of staff
he was your
at
right
Texas
hand
Tech.
Yeah.
And now is chairman of the budget committee.
And he's doing a great job. Jody's a good friend, and you want to talk about
he's a great
sending
friend
your
yours.
people on to do well. I was actually, when I was saying that, I was thinking of Jody as a great example. That you sent him on, and he's having an impact, and that's got to make you proud every day.
Oh, it does. It does. And he passed a budget week before last that in the House, it didn't get much publicity because it was really good. And the Republican Party, they were united behind him.
Yep.
And they didn't have a big blow up. And if it had a big blow up, it'd have made a lot of front page news.
Yep.
But I saw you, and you were running against Dewhurst.
Yep.
And everybody considered the lieutenant governor's powerful, and they're not going to lose. But you got the Club for Growth to help you, and so you started getting the money to be competitive. And at first you were not even competitive.
Yep.
But then you got to be competitive,
yeah.
and then you got in a runoff. When you got in the runoff on that election night of the primary, I knew you were going to be a U.S. senator because you got in the runoff, and I knew if you're a big statewide office holder and you don't win outright first time around, it's going to be awfully hard for you to get elected, and you won it.
Well, that's right, and it was. You want to talk about improbable elections. I mean, when I launched the campaign, when I went out to see you, I was literally at 2% in the polls. I'd never been elected to anything. I mean, the last thing I was elected to was student council, and so it was. I had no name ID. My first poll was at 2%. The margin of error was 3%.
Right.
And those are real. I came home to Heidi. I was all excited. I said, we're at 2%. She said, well, couldn't you be at -1?
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, thanks, sweetheart. Appreciate it. But it was what happened in that campaign. Number one, we worked our tails off. And an awful lot of time, the old saying that luck looks like hard work, that we just crisscrossed the state. And it was a grassroots campaign. And look, I was running against the sitting lieutenant governor at universal name ID, who anyone who had business in front of the legislature had to be with him because he controlled the Texas State Senate. And so you didn't have a choice on that. And also he was worth about $200 million. So he put $35 million of his own money into the race. And I mean, everyone just laughed when I said I was running. But what we did is we ran a grassroots campaign where we had young people, we had Hispanics, we had Republican women, we had, It was a blue-collar campaign. You look at the folks who supported us, it was volunteers, and we unified conservatives, and we built a coalition that we went from 2% to I ended up winning the primary by 14 points and winning the general by 16 points. It was breathtaking.
It was an election. I didn't think you had a chance.
Yeah.
And then I started watching, and I saw that you got the money. And I said, he's serious. He's serious. And then I saw different little groups, and a little group here and a little group here, and it all added up. And all of a sudden, you're in that runoff. And the night you made the runoff, I said, he's going to be our next U.S. Senator.
Well, and that was always our strategy. So I may have said this when I talked to you. I told a lot of people, they'd say, well, how on earth, what's your plan? And I said, my plan's to come in second. And people would look at me and say, are you an idiot? And I said, look, no, it's real simple. There were 9 candidates running. I said, all I have to do is hold David Dewhurst to 49.9%. If I hold him to that, we'll go to a runoff. And if there's a runoff, we'll win that runoff. I just got to get him below 50. If he beats me, he's going to beat me on the first ballot. And people looked at me and said that was daft. But I said, we're going to build support. And we ended up on primary night. I succeeded. I came in second. He got 44% of the vote. I got 34%. So he was 10 points ahead of me. But that was below 50, so we had a runoff. Now, here's something interesting you may not know. So I'm at 10 points down. It's 44 to 34. We immediately went in the field, did a poll. What do you think the numbers were the next day after that primary election?
I have no idea.
I was at plus 15, a 25-point delta. And what's fascinating, I ended up winning 60 days later by 14 points. Now, you would think over those 60 days, it was kind of a steady linear thing that you climbed up 25 points steadily over 60 days. It was instantaneous. It was in 24 hours. And I've actually called that the winnability discount, which is before the primary, people said all the time, Cruz, you can't win. I may like you. I may like what you're saying, but it's impossible. It's hopeless. You can't win. And the instant we got in the runoff, people are like, hot diggity damn, this guy can win. And boom, we shot up 25 points in 24 hours.
Well, I think that people like me and the leadership across the state, they were looking at it and they saw how close you were and where you came from nowhere, from 2% to 34%.
Yep.
And so I think immediately people said, that's on election, I told Jody, he's our next U.S. Senator, period. That's it.
It was, and I'll tell you, going through that experience, it's liberating because the people who elected me are the people who were out in the blazing sun knocking on doors. I still remember a little old lady in East Texas who grabbed me by the shoulder. She said, Ted, promise me you won't go to Washington and become one of them. And I still see her eyes, and I made that promise. And look, as you know, it's hard serving in Congress, and you make tough decisions, and sometimes you'll have a bill where it's 51% good and 49% bad, or 51% bad and 49% good, and you struggle with what's the right answer. And what I try to do is just honor that promise. I try to follow the principles that I told the people of Texas I would. And I hear all the time as I travel the state, Democrats will come up to me and they'll say, I'll say this for you. You're doing what you said you would do. And I think that's what people want, but I also think it's what they have a right to expect of their elected officials.
Well, Ted, you've been a man of principle, and we appreciate. There are certain people just don't like you, and I think that goes back.
I don't follow you. What do you mean?
And there are certain people that they go after you every time. You know that, but they just don't like you, and I think they don't like your positions, so they try to dislike you. You've got to. One time I was waiting to see you. And in the room for the staff in the Judiciary Committee. I was waiting to see you, and Dick Durbin came by.
Yeah.
I knew Dick Durbin when I was in Congress with him.
Sure.
His friend, we were visiting everything. You came out and you said, what are y'all doing? And we visited, and it was a good visit in that, he did. I watched him. He didn't dislike you. He disagreed with you. And y'all could have some strong arguments. But too many times people think that you've got to hate the people you disagree with. And I've watched you, and you have not succumbed to that. And I appreciate that.
Well, look, I emphatically agree. I worry about our country that we're so bitter, we're so divided, we scream and yell, and we don't talk to each other. And the way I try to approach things is that I can't control what others do, but I can control what I do. So I don't make character attacks. I don't go into the gutter. I'll disagree with someone on policy, on substance. I think that's actually doing your job, but I don't go after and slander their character. And it's, one of the things I've done, we're doing a podcast. I launched a podcast 4 years ago. It's called Verdict with Ted Cruz. We do it 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We've got just under 1 million unique listeners every month listen to the podcast. We beat CNN every single week. And part of the reason is I think people want to know what's really going on. And one of the things we do, we go to college campuses, and I'll do it live in front of hundreds of students and do 90 minutes of Q&A from students, many left-wing students. But people want to engage and do so on substance, and we ought to talk to each other. And I'll tell you a funny story. I know we're wrapping up, but a funny story. So in the 2020 Democrat primary for president, there were 3 different Democrats running for president: Amy Klobuchar, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Cory Booker, all of whom told the exact same joke on the campaign trail. All 3 of them said, heck, I even worked with Ted Cruz. And in a Democrat primary, people cracked up laughing on that, but all 3 of them are good friends of mine. I've worked closely with all 3 of them and with a bunch of other Democrats, because we've got to, I've passed 94 different pieces of legislation since I've been in the Senate.
Right.
And you do that by focusing on substance and actually trying to solve problems. You don't give up your principles, but you look for where do we have common ground that we can make a difference for the people of Texas.
Well, I appreciate all that you do in working with different groups, and also what you do for the general public in the state of Texas. And this has been an interview that really wasn't about it's about you. And I want people to know you. And I think if they know you, then you're going to get their vote.
Well, thank you, my friend. I appreciate your friendship and your mentorship.
Thank you.